Hello listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing energy matters in an informal setting. Over the past few months, we have talked in detail about reforms of Europe's energy markets. I think it's safe to say that in coming episodes, we will also digest and discuss the proposals published by the European Commission. But this week, we look at the impact on one sector that is growing fast and which will form an integral part of the energy transition, the battery and storage industry. What does the proposed regulation mean for the fairly new but expanding sector, as several firms have said they are mulling a move to the US? The scramble for subsidies is certainly on for this part of the industry. I'm Richard Sverrisson, and joining me today is Giorgio Corbetta of Eurobat, the Association of European Automotive and Industrial Battery Manufacturers. Welcome back on the pod, Giorgio. This time you have a different hat on, though.
Hi, Richard. Indeed. I think we talked a couple of years back, and it's great to be back on the pod. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. I'd like just to sort of start talking a little bit about the battery sector. I mean, which companies, for example, do you represent, and how are they doing at the moment, sort of following the pandemic and the energy crisis?
Absolutely. So as Eurobat, as you mentioned, we represent mostly European battery manufacturers. Most of them actually have a global scope. So most of our members are, I would say, mid or in the middle, I would say, of the battery value chain. We do represent also different kind of companies upstream and more kind of downstream too. But once again, I would say that the bulk of the membership is indeed the midstream battery manufacturers. And just to give you some context on what battery technology actually looks like now, we do represent all different battery technologies. And that includes, obviously, lithium, nickel, but also lead. And I think it's important to remember that even though much of the discussions now in the European Union and actually globally focus on newer battery technologies, lead and lead batteries have been around for over a year. And I think that's where, in particular, when it comes to Europe, most of the skills, much of the experience and the expertise when it comes to the battery market, also from manufacturing and recycling perspective, is actually coming from.
Okay. It's good to clear that. But where, for example, where are often the best locations for these mega battery factories?
Once again, just because we've been doing batteries or making batteries in the European Union for over 100 years, we do have many plants all around the European Union member states and actually beyond that, right? I think one important one additional piece of information is that obviously batteries are part of a global value chain, and that, in a way makes businesses and running a battery manufacturing business more kind of complex because of the trends and the changes you're actually exposed to as a manufacturer, both, when it comes to where you source the raw material from to, how you actually embed the batteries in different appliances that actually make use of the battery. But, I think when it comes to the gigafactories, you can see them really all around. You see them in Italy, in Spain, in France, in the Nordics too. So I think it's, there's obviously a number of criteria that are factored into, the decision of where to base a battery manufacturing plant, and that, concerns naturally the logistics. So whether it's easy to move goods in and out of the plant, how close you are to where you actually sell the battery, but also, what are the conditions where you actually are in terms of also how green actually the electricity is. I think that's also one of the factors, because most of the gigafactories that we see now, of course, place an increasing value in how green, in obviously marketing their products as basically green ones. And this is also where we see the customer demands moving into. So I would say there's no one place. That's also, I would say, the beauty of the European Union single market, which is obviously one of the questions that we're probably discussing now too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we hear, well, some of the focus is on the gigafactories and especially the more recent ones maybe that have been established a base, for example, in the Northern Nordics. I just want to sort of double check a couple of facts with you, Giorgio. If so, we hear that, to produce to 40 to 50 gigawatt hour battery would consume something between 300 and 360 megawatts a year. Would that be correct?
Well, I think it very much depends. Of course, you have different assessments, and we're probably reading the same reports. Because we don't have a report of our own, I don't think I can actually confirm that. But I think I know where that figure is coming, and I think it's accurate, depending on where your plan is and what kind of technology you're actually using.
Of course, the main point being here is to say that these are very important consumers of electricity, these factories.
That is true.
And they're
for sure true.
And they're an important part of the demand side in the market. So that's, I think,
absolutely.
I think that's very good to bear in mind. But if we can move on to, we've seen recent headlines, across the media, for example, battery manufacturers looking or mulling a move to the US. What's happening here, Giorgio?
So that's one of the million-dollar questions, and I think we do see that. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And this is essentially coming, as most of your listeners will probably know, from the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, and that was I would say package of financial aid that was released in the US last year. And of course, one of the advantages of that from the perspective of, clean tech manufacturers is that it's very comprehensive and it makes it very easy to calculate the net present value of a plant. I think it's a raft of subsidies that, I think it's true, and it's attractive not only to battery manufacturers, but also other clean tech or other value chain kind of players are naturally looking at this. So I think when it comes to reaction from European businesses, what we see across our membership is that depends where you're based, right? So naturally, manufacturers who are based in the US are looking at that as a huge opportunity, to boost their production. But also, if you have manufacturers which might not, be based necessarily in the US, but with operations in the US, that's also something interesting, and that's also something they look at when it comes to, making a decision on where to put their plant. And this is probably the specific example we're talking about here. But I think it's also important to mention that the IRA is really something which, of course, we're not in a position to judge on whether this is actually good or bad. But for sure, it depends where you're from and also where you're based. And B, this is really something which will have an impact on the global battery and probably more upstream raw materials value chain. And I think there's also a set of battery manufacturers who, don't necessarily look at the IRA as something positive for their business.
What do you mean there exactly, Giorgio?
Well, I mean, of course, I think we have players who are not, which, would not necessarily benefit as things are now. Things might change, as we know, but, as things stand now, there is many players who won't be able to actually benefit and, don't have the opportunity to even move to the US in order to be able to get those kind of benefits.
Let's talk about the European response here. What's your view here? Has the response from policymakers in Brussels, where you are based, has that been adequate? Is that satisfactory to prevent? I mean, the companies I mentioned that have openly said their mulling moves are like Northvolt or Freyr, based in the Northern Nordics. But so to try for the European Union to provide an incentive for them to stay within, for battery manufacturers to stay within the internal energy market, if you like. That's where it's crucial for us. Has the response been good enough?
Sure. So naturally, I can't talk about any specific member or company.
Sure, of course not.
But when it comes to the European response, I think first thing it's important to also flag that one of the beauties, I think, one of the positives of the Inflation Reduction Act is that it's really support the conversation around what's the European clean tech industrial policy. So that's definitely a positive move. And, if you think that the EU Battery Action Plan, which is, it's really the roadmap as to how to, support and grow the EU domestic battery value chain, dates back 2017 or 2018, I think the context is completely changed. So naturally, that's the opportunity to take another look at what we need in terms of industrial policy if we really want to develop or continue developing a EU battery value chain. But in terms of the actual response, I think it's also important and interesting to mention that, this was coming really out of the blue. So I don't think us as European industry and even European Union policymakers were ready for that. So I think when it comes to the European Commission response, we need to also, I would say, in a way, applaud the European Commission because they're putting together a set of measures in a relatively little time. And I think this response probably revolves around three things mainly. One is the TCTF, which is one of the acronyms that we're probably gonna unpack now, which is the Temporary Crisis and Transition Framework for the state aid, which is essentially an amendment to the state aid framework. And that's really the first kind of pillar of the response by the European Union as we see it. Then, of course, it's much more granular, but the main lines are these ones, right? And that was actually published last week. So of that, we know most of it, I would say. But the other two pillars were really the NZIA, which is the Net Zero Industry Act, which looks more at the, I would say, downstream segment of the clean tech value chain. And the third one is the Critical Raw Materials Act, which really looks at the upstream, right? So, how can the European Union source raw materials in a safe, and in a sustainable way moving forward.
So if we can start with the first of those, the first kind of legislation, so the loosening of the state aid rules, basically, to enable national governments to pump money into these type of ventures, as well as maybe, solar panels, turbines, heat pumps, but batteries are certainly a key element of this. So my question is, which national governments can afford to put this kind of money in, because you're not talking small sums.
No. And I think, that's really the debate that we've been seeing now for the past few weeks, right? I think what we would say is that, of course, we like very much batteries being explicitly picked as relevant equipment for the transition towards net zero economy. And, we, of course, know that batteries play an obvious role in achieving the Green Deal objectives, though a clarification of that in the context of a state aid measure or revision of measures is obviously good. Really from the perspective of the investors, it gives probably more clarity to industry as to what the way forward is. And, I think if you look at it, the combination of the COVID-19 war in the Ukraine and also inflation now, of course, has worsened a lot the business case for building and recycling also batteries in the European Union. So from our perspective, providing more slack to member state to support the EU domestic battery value chain is definitely very good. And I think what we're explicitly looking at was the option to match foreign aid in exceptional circumstances. So when there is a clear threat of a company which is actually critical for the EU to achieve its net zero ambition to actually move elsewhere, right? And this is obviously critical to battery manufacturers, which of course operate under shareholders' value maximization rules, and this is very important to stay in the European Union and also something we're hoping for. Of course, that probably goes beyond the side of things we have an opinion on. But of course, when it comes to the battery value chain, it is not only global, but also very, very local in the European Union and across the different member states. So obviously you have a high number of small and medium enterprises, right, which are part of that. And, based on where they are, might not get as much help as they need. So I think when you ask, which are the countries that could put much, more money in relative and probably also in absolute terms into supporting battery investments, we know what they are. Of course, it's the larger economies. So one of our points there is, of course, that we shouldn't forget that one key enabler of a true new battery value chain is, of course, the EU single market, and that should be obviously preserved.
Of course, and that's very much come to the fore this week is clearly that the European Commission doesn't want to interfere with a lot of the wholesale market price, certainly the pricing mechanisms, which I think was a relief to many in the market. But I suppose the crucial question is, Giorgio, will it be enough to prevent this kind of industrial flight?
Yeah, that's unfortunately one of the many questions I don't think I have a sound answer for. And I think we'll see, right? As you mentioned, those information are actually public. So I think, that on this, what I can say is that the legislation is very clear, right? So member states would have, under set of circumstances, the possibility to actually match that kind of investment. So if you read it to the letter, then that should be, enough. But of course, I think here we're obviously focusing on the financial aspect, right? Which is obviously critical, in particular when it comes to the capex. But I think what's also interesting here is the relationship that EU battery manufacturers have been obviously building with the entire ecosystem at a regional, EU, and local level, which is also something that those companies also value. So I think this has to be seen in the context of, it's all part of a more complex environment and a more kind of complex set of decisions that a company needs to make when it comes to actually figuring where they want to put their plan.
Absolutely. I mean, do you think, for example, maybe that the EU is prioritizing other factors such as maybe the production of green hydrogen over storage and batteries, or are they on the sort of same sort of level playing field?
Well, I think once again, if you look this time at the Net Zero Industry Act, I think there is a set of clean techs which are clearly picked as the ones which are best helping the European Union get into net zero. And I think both batteries and green hydrogen are there. So I'm not sure I can say that I see a dichotomy between batteries and hydrogen. I think those are two different technologies for two different uses.
Yeah, they can happily coexist, and if they receive the kind of the financial support needed, so they can. And of course, they're an important part of the green transition. Let's not be said. But are there any sort of barriers that remain? So obstacles within the legal framework that maybe are preventing a rapid rollout of batteries, Giorgio?
I think there is, and if I can actually summarize that, probably, I think the main issue we see is the consistency across different pieces of legislation. And I think for batteries, the regulatory framework is obviously very complex because, of course, you don't only have legislation on the battery as a product, but you also have legislation on the product where the batteries actually go. And that's many. If you think of vehicles, if you think of energy storage for the power grid, and many others. But then you also have horizontal legislation on when it comes to, due diligence. And on top of that, of course, you're also going to have, and here we're probably also really touching upon the Critical Raw Materials Act, sustainability and circularity of the product and of the substances that go into the product as such. So the regulatory ecosystem is very complex, and I think one of the issues or one of the criticalities is that it's not easy to make sense of what are the obligations across the different member states, as of course, if you think about it, the main piece of legislation, and probably the more consequential piece of legislation for batteries, is a directive which is called the Battery Directive, which dates back 2006 and is now being replaced by the Batteries Regulation, which has been agreed informally by the co-legislators of the European Union last year. And of course, that to our mind, that should be the main piece of legislation when it comes to, giving clear guidance to battery manufacturers and in general, everyone who has a say and who have a stake in the battery value chain in different fashion, as to how they should manage their business, from the very beginning, sourcing of the raw materials to the recycling and the disposal of the batteries. And that clarity is not there. So I think, if anything, we would say, look, we have the batteries regulation, or we will have batteries regulation. That should be the main piece of legislation, whilst actually what we see is that there's a plethora of other pieces of legislation which, of course, mandate different provisions when it comes to, batteries in the power system, batteries for cars, but also if you think of everything that goes with sustainability and the classification of the substances that go into the batteries, that's really a very complex regulatory framework, which, we hope something like the Critical Raw Materials Act won't worsen in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's obviously your role here, Giorgio, in a way, isn't helping companies in the sector to navigate this minefield of legislation and rules and regulation that impacts the sector. But as a kind of final question, I'd like to ask is, as we roll out renewable energy and renewable energy sources, solar, wind, hydro, whatever it may be, the role of batteries is crucial here in storage, and especially in those times when there isn't any, on a still cloudy day, when or at night, the so-called Dunkelflaute in Germany in winter. So the rollout of batteries is going to be crucial. Is it happening fast enough, do you think?
When it comes to batteries for storage of electricity, the political support and the political push is there precisely because of what you mentioned, right? So we need to decarbonize the power grid at an increasingly higher pace, And I think that's why batteries are an obvious ally and an obvious enabler of that. I think if you look at, how the power market is also evolving, naturally, there are obviously concerns about, the potential reform of the power market. But the power market and the power system is getting more and more sophisticated. So the role of batteries is even clearer now, which means that, that doesn't have always, a direct effect on the business case. But of course, it helps, I think, a faster deployment. When it comes to whether that's fast enough, I think the way I understand that is compared to how fast we need to go to get to net zero by 2050. And I think, the answer, is, might be different, with respect to where you stand. But I think for sure we see the role of batteries being increasingly, I would say, clear to any stakeholder. Of course, we're speaking mostly with basically the policymakers, but those who also have an understanding of how the power system and the power market works, increasingly rely on or increasingly conceive actually batteries as a key enabler of the decarbonization of the power system as such, really.
And that's a very important step, of course, along the way. Yeah. And I think maybe to summarize, then, so far so good, doing satisfactory, but could do much better and faster. Yeah.
That's always the case, I guess. But when it comes to how the battery market is moving forward, I think, of course, there's need of more batteries, and of course, we're not even discussing here the role of batteries in the decarbonization of transport, right? Which is probably going to be for another episode of the pod.
For sure. Giorgio, thank you very much for being a guest again on the Montel Weekly podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Goodbye.
So, listeners, you can now follow the podcast on our own Twitter account, aptly named the Montel Weekly Podcast. Please direct message any suggestions, questions, or let us know if you think you have a good idea for a guest on the show. You can also send us an email to podcast@montelnews.com. Lastly, remember to keep up to date with all that's happening in energy markets on Montel News. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you and goodbye.